Black man took in 4 blind homeless quadruplets girls. 23 years later, they stopped her life sentence. The needle was already prepared when 4 blind women burst through the doors of Wayne County Courthouse, their desperate footsteps echoing like thunder through marble halls that had witnessed thousands of final moments but never anything like this. James Washington sat in shackles, orange jumpsuit stark against the mahogany defendant's chair, watching his daughters, Emma, Olivia, Sophia, and Ava, race against time itself. 23 years ago, he had pulled 4 dying children from a Detroit dumpster with his bare hands, their tiny fingers reaching through the darkness for a salvation they couldn't see. Now those same hands, grown strong and determined, carried briefcases full of evidence that would either save their father from lethal injection or watch him die for a murder he never committed. The clock on the courtroom wall ticked toward 3 p.m., execution time, while 4 extraordinary women prepared to do something that would shatter the entire justice system, prove that sometimes the children you save end up saving you right back, even when the whole world believes you're a killer. But this story doesn't begin in that Wayne County courthouse. It begins 23 years earlier, on a brutal February night in 1999, when James Washington was just a 35-year-old auto worker walking home from his late shift at the Ford Rouge plant in Dearborn, Michigan. Before we get deeper into the story, please let me know in the comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy the story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now, let's begin today's story. James had always carried invisible scars. Not by choice, but by a childhood that had carved emptiness into his soul. Growing up in Detroit's Cass Corridor, he'd watched his mother waste away from cancer when he was 12, her hospital bed at Detroit Medical Center becoming the last place he'd heard someone say, "I love you" to him. His father had vanished before James could even form memories of him, leaving behind only empty beer bottles and unpaid bills. The foster homes that followed taught James that love was a luxury with an expiration date. By 35, he lived alone in a modest house on Porter Street in Corktown, existing in the kind of hollow routine that some people mistake for contentment. Work, home, sleep, repeat. His heart had become a locked room where he kept all his unspoken dreams of family buried. That February night, Detroit's winter showed no mercy. The wind howled down Michigan Avenue like a living thing, and snow piled against abandoned buildings in the shadow of the Renaissance Center's towers. James pulled his worn coat tighter, his breath forming desperate clouds as he hurried past the shuttered shops and empty lots that bore witness to a city's struggle. He almost walked past the alley. A sound, so faint it barely registered above the wind's wail, made him freeze. James had learned to trust his instincts growing up in neighborhoods where ignoring the wrong sound could cost you everything. He turned toward the narrow passage between Romano's Italian restaurant and a boarded-up pharmacy. The sound came again. Crying. But not ordinary crying, the kind of desperate, exhausted sobs that come from children who have cried until their voices break. James stepped into the alley, his heart hammering against his ribs. Behind a rusted dumpster, barely visible in the sickly yellow glow from a distant streetlight, he saw them. 4 little girls, no more than 3 years old, huddled together like broken dolls someone had thrown away. Their clothes were nothing but torn fabric and hope, their faces streaked with grime and frozen tears. But what shattered every defense James had built around his heart wasn't just their condition, it was the way they moved. They were blind. All 4 of them. Their tiny hands reached out into the darkness they couldn't escape, fingers searching desperately for each other. The largest girl, though she couldn't have weighed more than 30 pounds, had wrapped her skeletal arms around the other 3, her body shaking violently as she tried to be their shield against the killing cold. "Mama," one of them whispered into the night. "Mama, please come back." James dropped to his knees in the filthy snow, his own tears freezing on his cheeks. These weren't just abandoned children. These were 4 pieces of his own broken heart, reflected back at him in the cruelest mirror imaginable. "Hey there, little angels," he whispered, his voice cracking like ice. The protective sister's head snapped toward his voice. "Please don't hurt us," she begged, and James could hear 20 lifetimes of fear in her small voice. "We'll be quiet. We promise we'll be quiet." James looked closer and saw the smallest one, Emma, unconscious in her sister's arms, her lips blue, her breathing so shallow it barely lifted her tiny chest. Hypothermia was claiming her, and the others weren't far behind. "What are your names, sweethearts?" James asked, stripping off his coat. "I'm Olivia," the protective one whispered. "This is Emma, and Sophia, and Ava. Are you going to take us back to the bad place?" The bad place. James felt rage and heartbreak collide in his chest. Without another word, he gathered all 4 girls into his coat, feeling how their small bodies fit against him like puzzle pieces he'd been missing his entire life. "No, baby girl," he promised, standing with his precious cargo. "You're never going back to any bad place. You're coming home." As James Washington carried 4 shivering angels through the streets of Detroit toward a house that had been empty for too long, he had no idea he was carrying his future, his redemption, and 23 years later, his salvation from death row. Have you ever had a moment that completely changed your life's direction? Share in the comments what you would have done in James's shoes. Sometimes guardian angels come in the smallest packages. The front door of 1247 Porter Street hadn't opened to the sound of children's voices in over 2 decades. As James fumbled with his keys, the 4 girls trembling in his arms, the house seemed to hold its breath, as if it knew that everything was about to change forever. Inside, James's modest living room felt cavernous and cold. The space that had sheltered his solitude for years suddenly seemed insufficient, empty, wrong. He gently placed the girls on his worn leather couch, the one piece of furniture his mother had left him, and for the first time in his adult life, James Washington didn't know what to do with his hands. Emma, the smallest, was still unconscious. Her breathing came in tiny, frightening gasps that seemed to echo off the bare walls. Sophia and Ava clung to each other, their sightless eyes wide with terror, while Olivia, brave, protective Olivia, sat like a tiny sentinel, her hand resting on Emma's forehead. "She's so cold," Olivia whispered, and James heard a lifetime of responsibility in her 3-year-old voice. "She's been cold for so long." James knelt before them, studying their faces in the warm lamplight. They were identical, for perfect mirrors of each other, but each carried her own shade of suffering. Emma's face was gaunt, her cheekbones sharp beneath skin that looked like tissue paper. Sophia rocked back and forth, humming a broken lullaby to herself. Ava's thumb was raw from sucking, her other hand constantly reaching for sisters she couldn't see. And Olivia. Olivia looked like she'd been carrying the world on shoulders too small to bear it. "Can you tell me what happened to you?" James asked softly, settling onto the coffee table so he was at their level. Olivia's head tilted toward his voice. Even blind, she seemed to be studying him, weighing whether this stranger could be trusted with their truth. "The people said they couldn't keep us," she finally whispered. "Said blind babies were too much trouble. Too expensive." Her voice cracked on the word expensive, and James felt something break inside his chest. "They put us in the car and then we were in the cold place. Emma kept crying for Mama, but Mama never came." "How long have you been out there?" James asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "3 sleeps," Sophia said suddenly, her voice tiny and musical. "Maybe 4. The dark is always the same when you can't see." 3 days. These babies had survived 3 days in a Detroit winter, abandoned behind a dumpster like garbage. James stood abruptly, pacing to the window, his hands shaking with rage at a world that could discard innocence so casually. "Are you leaving too?" Ava asked, and the terror in her voice spun James around. "No, sweetheart. I'm not going anywhere. He returned to them, kneeling again. But we need to get you warm and fed. Can you trust me to take care of you? We don't have money, Olivia said quickly. We can't pay you. But we're good girls. We don't eat much. The casual way she offered to earn her keep, this 3-year-old child negotiating for survival, nearly brought James to his knees. He reached out slowly, telegraphing his movements, and gently touched Olivia's hand. You don't have to earn anything, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You're not here to work. You're here to be little girls. To be safe. To be loved. The word loved seemed to hang in the air like something foreign, something none of them, including James, quite knew how to handle. What's loved mean? Sophia asked, tilting her head like a curious bird. James felt his heart crack wide open. How do you explain love to children who've never experienced it? How do you describe light to someone who's only known darkness? Love means. James started, then stopped. Words felt inadequate. Instead, he gently lifted Emma, her tiny body frighteningly light in his arms. Love means I'm going to take care of Emma now. Love means you'll never be cold again. Love means when you're scared, someone will hold you. Love means you belong somewhere. As if responding to his words, Emma's eyes fluttered open for the first time. Though she couldn't see, she turned her face toward James's voice, and her small hand reached up to touch his cheek. "Daddy," she whispered, the word so soft it was barely breath. That single word, Daddy, hit James Washington like lightning. In that moment, sitting in his empty living room with 4 broken angels in his arms, every wall he'd built around his heart crumbled to dust. He wasn't James Washington, lonely auto worker, anymore. He was someone's daddy. He was their daddy. "Yes, baby girl," he whispered back, tears streaming down his face. "Daddy's here. Daddy's got you." And in that sacred moment, as Emma smiled for what might have been the first time in her short life, James Washington found his purpose. He found his family. He found his reason for breathing. None of them knew that this moment, this holy exchange of trust and love, would one day echo in a courtroom and save his life. Have you ever experienced a moment that instantly changed who you were meant to be? Tell us in the comments about the moment love found you when you least expected it. The social worker's heels clicked against the linoleum floor of the Wayne County Department of Health and Human Services like a countdown timer. Mrs. Patricia Hendricks had seen it all in her 15 years with the system, but something about this case made her stomach twist with unease. "Mr. Washington," she said, settling into the uncomfortable plastic chair across from James in the sterile conference room. Her manila folder lay thick with paperwork between them like a wall. "We need to discuss the situation with the 4 girls." James felt his jaw tighten. It had been 3 weeks since he'd found Emma, Olivia, Sophia, and Ava. 3 weeks of sleepless nights learning how to braid hair, how to guide tiny hands to food, how to sing lullabies he'd never heard but somehow knew. 3 weeks of watching 4 broken souls slowly begin to heal in the warmth of unconditional love. "Their names are Emma, Olivia, Sophia, and Ava," James said firmly. "Not the 4 girls. They have names." Mrs. Hendricks adjusted her glasses, her expression softening slightly. "Mr. Washington, I understand you've grown attached, but we've located a specialized facility in Chicago. The Illinois Institute for Visually Impaired Children has experience with multiple disabled siblings. They have resources, trained staff, medical support." "They have each other," James interrupted. "They have me. They have a home. You're a single man with no experience raising children, let alone 4 blind children with special needs." Mrs. Hendricks opened her folder, revealing photographs and documents. "These girls require intensive care, specialized education, medical intervention. The costs alone. I don't care about the costs. Mr. Washington, be realistic. You work factory shifts. You have no training in disability care. No support system. No legal standing. She leaned forward, her voice taking on the practiced tone of someone who delivered difficult truths for a living. These children deserve better than good intentions. James felt something cold and familiar settle in his chest, the same feeling he'd carried since childhood, the certainty that good things weren't meant for people like him. But then he thought of Emma's laugh that morning when Sophia had accidentally put syrup in her orange juice. He thought of Ava learning to navigate his living room by counting steps. He thought of Olivia whispering good night, Daddy, every evening like a prayer. You don't understand, James said, his voice rising. They're not broken things that need fixing. They're my daughters. Legally, they're not. Mrs. Hendricks's words hit like a gavel. You have no custody, no adoption papers, no legal relationship to these children whatsoever. Right now, you're essentially harboring wards of the state. Meanwhile, 800 miles away in Chicago, Dr. Margaret Chun was reviewing the case file at the Illinois Institute for Visually Impaired Children. The clinical photographs showed 4 malnourished girls with severe developmental delays, victims of what appeared to be systematic neglect and abandonment. Blind quadruplets, she murmured to her colleague, Dr. Rodriguez. When was the last time we saw something like this? Never, Dr. Rodriguez replied, studying the medical reports. The miracle is they survived at all. Whoever abandoned them behind that dumpster probably assumed they'd die. Dr. Chun frowned at the recent reports from Detroit. This man who found them, James Washington, he's refusing to surrender them to proper care. Typical savior complex, Dr. Rodriguez said dismissively. Finds some abandoned kids, thinks love conquers all. Reality will hit soon enough when he realizes what he's taken on. Back in Detroit, that reality was hitting James like a sledgehammer. That evening, as he helped the girls eat dinner, mashed potatoes and chicken cut into tiny pieces they could manage, he felt the weight of Mrs. Hendricks's words pressing down on him. Emma dropped her spoon, and it clattered to the floor with a sound that seemed too loud in the small kitchen. She immediately started crying, that heartbreaking sob of a child who expected punishment for the smallest mistake. I'm sorry, she whispered, her hands frantically searching the air. Please don't send us away. James knelt beside her chair, gently taking her trembling hands in his. Emma, sweetheart, accidents happen. Nobody's going anywhere. But even as he said it, James felt the doubt creeping in. What if Mrs. Hendricks was right? What if love wasn't enough? What if his selfish desire to keep them was actually hurting them? That night, after tucking the girls into the 2 beds he'd pushed together in his spare room, James sat alone at his kitchen table with a bottle of beer growing warm in his hands. The house felt different now, alive, filled with purpose, but the doubts gnawed at him like a physical pain. His phone rang. Mrs. Hendricks. Mr. Washington, I've spoken with the administrators in Chicago. They're willing to keep the girls together, which is unusual. They understand the bond between the siblings. But we need to move quickly. The longer this drags out, the harder it will be on everyone. They're sleeping, James said, looking toward the bedroom where he could hear Sophia humming softly to her sisters. They're safe. They're happy. For now. But what happens when you realize you can't handle it? What happens when the medical bills pile up? When you lose your job because you're too tired to function? When you meet someone who doesn't want to take on 4 disabled children? Mrs. Hendricks's voice carried the weight of too many failed placements. Mr. Washington, I've seen this story before. It doesn't end well. After hanging up, James walked to the bedroom doorway and watched his girls sleep. Olivia had somehow positioned herself between the others and the door, even in sleep protecting her sisters. Emma clutched a small stuffed rabbit he'd bought her, the first toy she'd ever owned. Sophia and Ava held hands across the small space between beds, their connection transcending sight. For the first time since finding them, James Washington wondered if loving them meant letting them go. Sometimes love means making impossible choices. What do you think James should do? Follow his heart or listen to the experts? Share your thoughts below. This decision will change everything. The fluorescent lights in Judge Maria Santos's courtroom buzzed with an irritating persistence that seemed to match the tension crackling through the air. James sat at a worn wooden table, his hands folded so tightly his knuckles had gone white, while across the aisle, Mrs. Hendricks shuffled through her mountain of paperwork with the efficiency of someone who'd fought these battles 1,000 times before. "Your Honor," Mrs. Hendricks began, her voice carrying the weight of institutional authority, "the state's position is clear. Mr. Washington, while well-intentioned, lacks the resources, training, and legal standing to care for 4 disabled children with complex needs." Judge Santos, a woman whose 20 years on the family court bench had shown her humanity's full spectrum, looked down at the case file. 4 blind quadruplets, ages 3, found abandoned behind a dumpster in downtown Detroit. One man, unmarried, no children, requesting emergency custody. "Mr. Washington," Judge Santos said, her voice gentler than Mrs. Hendricks's but no less serious, "I understand you formed an attachment to these children, but this court must consider what's in their best interest." James started to respond, but the courtroom doors opened with a creak that made everyone turn. A court officer wheeled in 4 small chairs, and James's heart stopped as he saw his girls being led into the room. Emma, Olivia, Sophia, and Ava walked in a careful line, each girl's hand resting on the shoulder of the one in front of her. They'd been cleaned up for court, their hair brushed, wearing matching pink dresses that some well-meaning social worker had provided, but James could see the fear radiating from their small bodies like heat. "Daddy," Olivia called out, her voice cutting through the formal atmosphere like a blade. "Daddy, where are you?" The sound of that word, Daddy, spoken with such desperate need, such absolute trust, seemed to suck all the air from the room. James started to rise, but Mrs. Hendricks placed a firm hand on his arm. "Mr. Washington, please remain seated," Judge Santos instructed, but her voice had changed. She was no longer just a judge looking at a case file. She was a mother who had heard something that made her chest tight. "We want to go home," Emma said, her small voice barely audible. "We want to go home to Daddy." Dr. Margaret Chun had driven down from Chicago for this hearing, her clinical assessment ready to present to the court. She'd planned to explain the specialized care these children needed, the resources her facility could provide. But watching 4 tiny girls reach blindly for a man who clearly meant everything to them, her prepared speech felt suddenly hollow. "Your Honor," Dr. Chun said, standing slowly, "perhaps we could arrange a temporary solution while we assess the situation more thoroughly." Judge Santos raised an eyebrow. This wasn't what she'd expected from the institutional representative. "What kind of temporary solution, Dr. Chun?" "Court-supervised custody," Dr. Chun said, the words coming out before she'd fully thought them through. "Mr. Washington could maintain care of the children while we implement support services. Weekly evaluations, medical monitoring, educational assessment. If he can demonstrate adequate care with professional support." Mrs. Hendricks looked stunned. "Dr. Chun, this is highly irregular. The protocol is clear." "The protocol," Dr. Chun interrupted, "doesn't account for what I'm seeing here." What she was seeing was Sophia, the gentlest of the 4, somehow sensing the tension in the room and beginning to hum, a soft, wordless melody that seemed to wrap around everyone present like a blanket. It was the same tune James had heard her humming every night, a song that came from somewhere deeper than memory. "Where did you learn that song, sweetheart?" Judge Santos asked, her judicial composure cracking slightly. "Daddy sings it," Sophia said simply. "When the scary dreams come. Daddy's voice makes them go away." James felt his eyes burn. He'd been humming old Motown melodies, songs his mother used to sing, without even realizing it. These girls had somehow absorbed his unconscious attempts to comfort them and made the music their own. "Your Honor," James said, rising slowly despite Mrs. Hendricks's disapproving look. "I know I'm not what you'd call qualified on paper. I don't have degrees or training or money. But I have something else." He looked at his girls, these four pieces of his heart sitting bravely in oversized chairs. "I have time. I have patience. I have a house that's been empty too long and a heart that was dying before they saved it." "Saved it?" Judge Santos prompted. "They think I rescued them," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "But the truth is, they rescued me. For 35 years, I was just going through the motions of living. These girls gave me a reason to wake up, a reason to come home, a reason to believe in tomorrow." Ava suddenly stood up from her chair, her small hands reaching out tentatively. "Daddy? Are they going to take us to the dark place again?" The courtroom fell silent except for the buzzing fluorescent lights and the sound of four little girls breathing in perfect synchronization, the way only siblings who'd survived impossible odds together could breathe. James looked at Judge Santos, at Mrs. Hendricks, at Dr. Chun, and made a decision that would bind them all together in ways none of them could imagine. "I'm not giving them up," he said quietly. "I don't care what it takes, what hoops I have to jump through, what conditions you set. These are my daughters. We're a family. And families don't abandon each other." Judge Santos studied the unusual tableau before her, one man and four children who had somehow found each other in a world that had failed them all. She thought about protocols and procedures, about risk assessments and best practices. Then she thought about the sound of a 3-year-old saying "Daddy," like it was the most sacred word in any language. "Court-supervised custody," she announced, her gavel poised. "Mr. Washington, you'll have 6 months to prove you can provide adequate care. Dr. Chun, your facility will provide consultation and support services. Mrs. Hendricks, you'll conduct weekly evaluations." The gavel fell with a sound like thunder, and James Washington officially became a father under the watchful eyes of a system designed to protect children from people exactly like him. People with more love than qualifications, more heart than resources. As the court dispersed, James knelt to embrace his daughters, and Olivia whispered in his ear, "We knew you wouldn't leave us, Daddy. We knew." But what none of them knew was that this forced proximity with the system would create a paper trail, a documented history of devotion and sacrifice that would one day be the only thing standing between James Washington and a lethal injection. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in September, 6 months after the court hearing that had changed everything. James was in the kitchen of his Porter Street home, now transformed with colorful rugs for safe navigation and furniture arranged so four little hands could find their way without fear. The return address made his blood run cold: Birmingham County Family Services, Alabama. Emma was practicing tying her shoes at the kitchen table, a skill that had taken months of patient guidance, when James saw the official envelope. His hands trembled as he opened it, and the words seemed to jump off the page like accusations. Investigation into the abandonment of minor children. Biological mother located. Cassandra Williams, requesting custody. Daddy. Olivia's voice cut through his shock. Even at 3.5, she had an uncanny ability to sense when something was wrong. "Your heart is beating fast. Are you scared?" James looked at his daughters, and felt the familiar clench of terror that had haunted his childhood. Just when you thought you were safe, just when you started to believe in happiness, The universe reminded you that love was a privilege that could be revoked without warning. I need to make a phone call, angels, he said, forcing his voice to stay steady. Keep practicing those shoes, Emma. You're getting so good. In his bedroom, James dialed the number at the bottom of the letter with shaking fingers. When a tired voice answered, he felt his world tilt on its axis. This is James Washington in Detroit. I got a letter about 4 little girls. Ah, Mr. Washington. The voice belonged to Ms. Ruby Johnson, a social worker whose drawl carried 20 years of hard cases and harder choices. I've been trying to piece together what happened to those babies. We found their mama, Cassandra Williams. She's got a story to tell. 2 days later, James drove the 8 hours to Birmingham, Alabama, leaving the girls with Mrs. Chun, who had become an unlikely ally in their fight to stay together. The Jefferson County Women's Correctional Facility sat like a concrete monument to broken dreams on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by razor wire and regret. Cassandra Williams was 24 but looked 40. Prison had carved lines around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and endless guilt. When she saw James through the scratched plexiglass, she broke down completely. "They told me you found my babies," she sobbed, her words barely comprehensible through the tears. "They told me they're alive." James stared at this broken woman who had given birth to his heart, and felt a complex mixture of rage and pity warring in his chest. "Why?" was all he could manage. "Why did you leave them to die?" Cassandra's story came out in fragments, between sobs and silences that spoke louder than words. She'd been 17 when she got pregnant, the result of a rape she'd never reported. The father was a man whose name she'd never known, whose face haunted her nightmares. When the doctors told her she was carrying quadruplets, all blind due to a rare genetic condition, she'd felt like God was punishing her for something she couldn't name. "I was homeless," she whispered, her hands pressed against the glass. "Living in my car, no family, no money. When they were born, the state said they'd help, but the foster families kept sending them back. Too much work, they said. Too expensive. We went through 6 homes in 2 years." James felt his anger wavering, replaced by something more complicated. "The last family," Cassandra continued, her voice breaking, "they said they couldn't handle it anymore. Said if I didn't take the girls back, they'd surrender them to the state. But I was using again, living with a man who said if I brought those broken kids around, he'd hurt them. So you left them in an alley to die. I thought someone would find them quick. There were people around, restaurants. I thought." She pressed her face against the glass, her tears leaving streaks. "I left them blankets. I kissed each one. I told them Mama loved them, but Mama couldn't protect them anymore." The weight of her confession settled between them like a stone. This wasn't a monster who had discarded her children. This was a broken girl who had made an impossible choice in an impossible situation. "I dream about them every night," Cassandra whispered. "I see their faces, hear them crying for me. Are they okay? Are they angry with me?" James thought of Emma's nightmares, how she still sometimes woke up crying for Mama. He thought of Olivia's fierce protectiveness, how she flinched whenever voices got too loud. He thought of Sophia's humming, a self-soothing behavior born from too much trauma too young. He thought of Ava's thumb-sucking, her constant need for physical contact. "They're healing," he said finally. "But they still hurt. They ask about you sometimes. Do they hate me?" James studied this woman who had given him everything that mattered, who had broken his daughter's hearts and simultaneously delivered them into his arms. "They're too young to hate. But they're old enough to remember being afraid." "I'm dying," Cassandra said suddenly. "Liver failure. The drugs, the drinking. The doctors say maybe a year, maybe less. Her eyes met his through the glass. I know I got no right to ask this, but could you tell them I'm sorry? Could you tell them their mama never stopped loving them, even when she couldn't keep them safe? James felt something shift inside him, a letting go of anger he'd been carrying like armor. This woman hadn't abandoned his daughters out of cruelty. She'd abandoned them out of a love so desperate and broken that it had convinced her they'd be better off without her. They have pictures, he said quietly, of you. From when they were babies. I tell them their mama loved them so much she made sure they found someone who could take care of them properly. It was a lie wrapped in truth, a story that would let 4 little girls sleep without the poison of abandonment eating their hearts. Cassandra's sob echoed through the visiting room. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for saving them. Thank you for being the daddy I could never find for them. On the drive back to Detroit, James called Mrs. Hendricks from a gas station in Bowling Green, Kentucky. The biological mother has signed away her parental rights, he told her. She's terminally ill. She wants the adoption to proceed. Mr. Washington, that simplifies things legally, but the court's concerns about your ability to provide adequate care. Then help me learn, James interrupted. Don't take them away because I don't know what I'm doing. Teach me. Help me become the father they need. There was a long pause. Then, the hearing is scheduled for next month. If Dr. Chen's facility will provide ongoing support services, and if you can demonstrate stable employment and adequate housing modifications. Whatever it takes, James said, watching the Kentucky sunset paint the sky in shades of hope. Whatever it takes. What James didn't know was that his phone call was being recorded as part of the state's documentation process. Every word of his conversation with Cassandra, every promise he'd made to those 4 little girls, every demonstration of his unwavering commitment was being filed away in a system that would remember his devotion long after everyone else had forgotten. 23 years later, that same system would be his salvation. Snow fell gently outside the windows of 1247 Porter Street as James knelt on the living room floor, his large hands guiding 4 smaller ones through the delicate work of making paper snowflakes. It had been 10 months since that life-changing February night, and the house had transformed into something James never thought possible, a home filled with laughter, music, and the chaotic beauty of family life. Mine looks like a spider, Sophia giggled, holding up her creation with pride. Her fingers had become remarkably skilled at feeling the shapes she cut, creating patterns that somehow came out more beautiful than anything sight could have produced. Spiders are good, Emma said seriously, carefully folding her paper with a methodical precision she brought to everything. Daddy says they catch bad things in their webs. James smiled, remembering the night Emma had been terrified by the idea of spiders in her room until he'd convinced her they were tiny guardians, protecting sleeping children from nightmares. Now spider references had become their secret code for feeling safe. Ava, the artist of the group, had somehow created a snowflake that actually resembled a flower. Her spatial awareness was extraordinary. She could navigate their house better than most sighted people could navigate their own homes. Tell us the Christmas story again, Daddy, she said, settling into his lap with the easy affection of a child who had never doubted her place in the world. Olivia, still the protector at 3.5, finished her snowflake and immediately moved to check on her sister's work. Emma's is the prettiest, she announced diplomatically, though her own creation was clearly the most intricate. They're all beautiful, James said, gathering his daughters closer. Just like the 4 angels who make them. The transformation in the girls over the past months had been miraculous. Emma had gone from a fragile child who barely spoke to a chattering butterfly who narrated everything she did. Sophia had discovered her gift for music, humming harmonies that seemed to come from some celestial source. Ava had developed an almost supernatural ability to see through touch, her fingers reading the world like Braille. And Olivia had evolved from a frightened guardian into a confident big sister who still protected but now also played. But it was the change in James that was perhaps most profound. "Daddy," Olivia said, settling against his chest, "tell us about when you were little." It was a question James had been avoiding for months. His own childhood was a landscape of disappointment and abandonment, not the kind of bedtime story you told children who needed to believe in forever love. But tonight, surrounded by the soft glow of Christmas lights he'd strung up for eyes that couldn't see them but hearts that could feel their warmth, James found himself wanting to share. "When I was little," he began, his voice soft in the lamplit room, "I lived with my mama in a house not far from here. She had the most beautiful voice. She used to sing while she cooked, and the whole house would smell like cornbread and sound like heaven." "What happened to her?" Emma asked, though something in her tone suggested she already knew the answer would be sad. "She got sick," James said simply. "And when she went to heaven, I forgot how to hear music for a long time." "Until us," Sophia said with the matter-of-fact wisdom of a child who understood more than anyone realized. "Until you," James confirmed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "You taught me how to hear music again." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, for little girls and one man who had all found in each other what the world had tried to take away. The house creaked gently around them, settling into its new identity as a place where love lived. "Daddy." Ava's small voice broke the quiet. "What's Christmas going to be like?" James thought about Christmases past, the loneliness, the empty rooms, the way he used to work extra shifts just to avoid the holiday altogether. Then he looked at the four faces turned toward him with such trust, such expectation of joy, and felt his heart expand in ways he didn't know were possible. "Christmas," he said, "is going to be exactly what it's supposed to be. It's going to be family." That night, after tucking the girls into their beds, now 4 individual twin beds arranged so they could still hold hands across the spaces, James stood in their doorway and listened to their whispered conversations. "Do you think Daddy loves us the same as real daddies love their real daughters?" Emma asked in that direct way children approach their deepest fears. "He chose us," Olivia said with absolute certainty. "Real daddies don't get to choose. They just get babies. But Daddy saw us and picked us to be his." "That makes it more special," Sophia added sleepily. "Like we're his favorite people in the whole world." "We are his favorite people," Ava said with a yawn. "And he's our favorite daddy." James pressed his back against the hallway wall, tears streaming down his face. In 10 months, these 4 angels had taught him that family wasn't about biology or blood. It was about choosing each other, again and again, especially when the world said your love didn't count. Dr. Chen's weekly reports had been glowing. The girls were thriving academically, emotionally, and physically. Their bond with James was clearly authentic and beneficial. Even Mrs. Hendricks had softened, noting in her evaluations that she'd never seen a more devoted father or more secure children. The adoption papers were being finalized. After Christmas, James Washington would legally become the father he'd already been in every way that mattered. As he settled into his own bed that night, James whispered a prayer to his mother, to whatever force had guided 4 lost souls to find each other. He thanked the universe for teaching him that sometimes the family you choose loves you harder than the family you're born with. What James couldn't know was that in a small apartment in Chicago, Dr. Chun was writing in her personal journal about a case that had changed her own perspective on love and family. What he couldn't foresee was that Mrs. Hendricks would keep every report, every note, every piece of documentation about their family in a special file she labeled Miracles. And what none of them could imagine was that these detailed records of devotion, this paper trail of unconditional love, would one day be the evidence that saved James Washington's life when the system turned against him. What's the most life-changing moment of love you've experienced or witnessed? Share in the comments how choosing love over fear has transformed your world, Because sometimes the family we choose becomes our greatest strength. The gavel's echo still rang in James Washington's ears as he was led away in shackles, the orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the navy suit he'd worn to what he thought would be a routine hearing. 23 years of being the perfect father, and it had all crumbled in a single afternoon. "Daddy!" The anguished cry came from the gallery, and James turned to see his daughters, now 26 years old, reaching toward him with the same desperate hands that had once searched for safety in a freezing alley. Emma, Olivia, Sophia, and Ava stood together, their faces streaked with tears, their world collapsing around the man who had been their anchor for over 2 decades. "I'm sorry," James mouthed to them as the bailiff pushed him forward. "I'm so sorry." The case had been building for months, a perfect storm of circumstantial evidence and prosecutorial ambition. Marcus Chun, no relation to Dr. Margaret Chun who had helped them years ago, had been found dead in his luxury apartment in downtown Detroit's Renaissance Center. A successful tech entrepreneur, Marcus had been James's supervisor at the Ford plant before striking it rich with a revolutionary automotive software company. The evidence seemed ironclad. James's fingerprints on Marcus's apartment door from a visit 3 days before the murder. Security footage showing James in the building. A heated argument between them that multiple witnesses had overheard. And most damning of all, Marcus's wallet found in James's work locker, planted there by someone who wanted to ensure James Washington would never see freedom again. But the real story was far more complicated. 3 months earlier, Marcus Chun had called James into his old supervisor's office at the Rouge plant with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Jimmy," he'd said, using the nickname that had always made James's skin crawl. "I've got a proposition for you." James had stood respectfully, though something about Marcus's tone set his teeth on edge. They'd worked together for 5 years before Marcus left Ford to start his company, and their relationship had always been complicated. "I'm expanding into new markets," Marcus had continued, settling behind his desk like a king addressing a subject. "Need someone I can trust to handle some discreet deliveries. Good money, easy work." "What kind of deliveries?" James had asked, though the way Marcus avoided his eyes told him everything he needed to know. "Better you don't ask too many questions. Just drive where I tell you, deliver what I give you. $5,000 a week, cash." James had felt his stomach turn. After 23 years of clean living, of being the kind of father his daughters could be proud of, Marcus was asking him to throw it all away. "I can't do that, Marcus. I won't risk my girl's future." Marcus's smile had turned cold. "Your girls. Right. For blind charity cases you picked up off the street. Tell me, Jimmy, how much does it cost to keep 4 disabled adults? College tuition for kids who'll never see their diplomas? Medical bills that never end." "They're my daughters," James had said quietly, but his hands had clenched into fists. "They're your weakness," Marcus had shot back. "And weaknesses can be exploited." The threat had been subtle but unmistakable. James had walked out of that office knowing he'd made an enemy, but he'd underestimated just how vindictive Marcus Chun could be. Present-day Wayne County Jail. Now, sitting in a cell that reeked of disinfectant and desperation, James understood how completely he'd been set up. Marcus had spent months building a case against him, planting evidence, creating a narrative that painted James as a desperate man who'd killed for money. The public defender assigned to his case was a tired woman named Lisa Martinez, who looked like she'd given up believing in justice years ago. "The evidence is overwhelming, Mr. Washington," she'd told him during their first meeting. "The prosecution is offering a plea deal, 25 years instead of life. I'd seriously consider it." "I didn't kill him," James had said for the 100th time. "It doesn't matter what you did or didn't do," she'd replied with brutal honesty. "It matters what a jury will believe. And right now they have fingerprints, video footage, witnesses, and the murder weapon with your prints on it. The murder weapon. A tire iron from James's own garage, somehow covered in Marcus's blood and James's fingerprints. The setup was so perfect it was almost artistic. But the cruelest part wasn't the false evidence or the corrupt investigation. The cruelest part was watching his daughters, his brilliant, successful daughters, try to maintain hope when their father had clearly lost his own. Emma had become a social worker, dedicating her life to protecting children the way James had protected them. Olivia was a disability rights lawyer, fighting the same system that had once tried to separate their family. Sophia was a music therapist who helped trauma victims find healing through song. And Ava was a sculptor whose work had been featured in galleries from New York to Los Angeles, her hands creating beauty that sighted artists envied. For women who had overcome impossible odds, who had turned their disabilities into superpowers, who had built successful lives on the foundation of one man's unwavering love. And now they were watching that man be destroyed by a system that had never believed someone like James Washington deserved happiness. "Daddy's innocent," Olivia had told every reporter who would listen, standing outside the courthouse with her sisters flanking her like a shield of righteous fury. Anyone who knows him knows he could never hurt anyone. But knowing and proving were different things entirely. The night before his sentencing, James lay on his narrow cot and thought about the irony of it all. He'd spent 23 years teaching his daughters that good always triumphed over evil, that love always found a way, that family was forever. Now he was about to be sentenced to die for a crime he didn't commit, and all those beautiful lies he'd told them were crumbling like paper snowflakes in the rain. Through the small window of his cell, he could see the Detroit skyline twinkling in the distance. Somewhere out there, 4 women who called him daddy were probably crying themselves to sleep, their faith in justice dying alongside their faith in him. James Washington closed his eyes and wondered if this was how the story was always meant to end, with love being punished, with good men paying for other men's sins, with 4 angels losing their father to a world that had never believed their family was real. Tomorrow he would stand before Judge Santos, the same woman who had given him 6 months to prove his love 23 years ago, and hear her sentence him to death. The circle was closing, and for the first time since that night in the alley, James Washington felt truly afraid. Have you ever felt like the world was punishing you for doing the right thing? Share in the comments how you found strength when everything seemed hopeless, because sometimes our darkest hour comes just before our greatest miracle. The law offices of Patterson, Williams & Associates in downtown Detroit's Fisher Building had never seen anything quite like the scene unfolding in Conference Room B. Emma Washington sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, her fingers dancing across her laptop's braille display with the precision of a surgeon, while her 3 sisters worked around her in the kind of synchronized harmony that only came from a lifetime of unbreakable bonds. "There has to be something," Emma said, her voice carrying the steel determination she'd inherited from James. 23 years of documentation. Someone somewhere made a mistake. Olivia paced the length of the conference room, her white cane tapping against the marble floor in a rhythm that matched her racing thoughts. As a disability rights attorney, she'd learned to navigate legal systems that underestimated her, but this case felt different. This was personal. This was family. "I've gone through every piece of evidence 3 times, she said, frustration bleeding through her professional composure. "The setup is too perfect. Whoever did this knew exactly how to frame Daddy." At the far end of the table, Sophia sat with her hands pressed to her temples, her extraordinary auditory memory working like a computer processing every conversation, every detail they discussed. Since childhood, she'd been able to recall sounds, voices, inflections with photographic precision, a gift that had made her one of the most sought-after music therapists in Michigan. "Play it again," she said suddenly. The recording from Marcus Chen's office. The argument between him and Daddy. Ava, her sculptor's hands never still, was working with modeling clay while she listened, a habit that helped her think. Her fingers shaped and reshaped the material as her mind worked through the problem from angles the others couldn't see. The recording crackled through the conference room speakers, Marcus's voice sharp with arrogance. "Your girls. Right. For blind charity cases you picked up off the street. Tell me, Jimmy, how much does it cost to keep 4 disabled adults?" Then their father's voice, controlled but tight with anger. "They're my daughters. They're your weakness. And weaknesses can be exploited." Sophia held up her hand. "Stop. Right there. Play it again." She listened with the intensity of someone reading between the lines of sound itself. "There," she said, her voice electric with discovery. "Do you hear it? The background noise during Marcus's threat." Emma's fingers flew across her braille keyboard, pulling up the audio analysis software she used in her social work. "What am I listening for?" "A phone," Sophia said, standing up so quickly her chair rolled backward. Someone was on speakerphone during that conversation. Marcus wasn't alone. The room fell silent except for the hum of the building's ventilation system and the distant sounds of Detroit traffic 40 floors below. Olivia stopped pacing, her cane frozen mid-tap. "You mean?" "I mean Marcus was performing for someone," Sophia continued, her voice gaining strength. "The timing, the phrasing, he was making sure someone else heard him threaten Daddy." Meanwhile, 3 miles away in a cell at Wayne County Jail, James Washington sat on his cot staring at his hands. The same hands that had pulled 4 dying children from a dumpster, that had braided countless pigtails, that had learned to read Braille so he could help with homework, that had wiped away 10,000 tears and applauded 10,000 small victories. Tomorrow, those hands would be declared the hands of a murderer. His court-appointed attorney had visited that morning with the final plea offer, life without parole instead of death. "Take it," Lisa Martinez had urged. "At least you'll be alive. Your daughters can visit." But James couldn't bring himself to plead guilty to something he didn't do. Even if it meant death, he wouldn't let his daughters spend the rest of their lives believing their father was a killer. Some principles were worth dying for. A guard's footsteps echoed down the corridor, stopping at James's cell. "Washington, you've got visitors." James expected to see his daughters, coming for what might be their last conversation as free family. Instead, he found himself face-to-face with someone he hadn't seen in over a decade, Dr. Margaret Chun, now gray-haired and wearing the tired expression of someone who'd spent her career fighting losing battles. "Hello, James," she said, settling into the plastic chair across from him in the visiting room. "I hear you're in trouble." "Dr. Chun." James managed a weak smile. "Didn't expect to see you here. I've been following the case." She opened a worn leather briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "I kept all my files from when we first met. Every report, every evaluation, every note about your family." "Why?" Dr. Chen's eyes softened. "Because what I witnessed with you and those girls changed how I understood family, changed how I understood love." She leaned forward. "James, I know you didn't kill anyone. The man who sang lullabies to 4 traumatized children, who learned Braille in his 40s, who worked 3 jobs to pay for music lessons he couldn't afford, that man doesn't murder people for money." "Doesn't matter what you believe," James said bitterly. "Evidence says otherwise." "Evidence can lie," Dr. Chen said firmly. "But 23 years of documented love? That tells the truth about who you really are." Back in the Fisher Building, the Washington sisters had made a discovery that sent electricity through the room. Ava's hands had gone still on her clay, her face pale with sudden understanding. "The phone call," she said slowly. "What if Marcus wasn't just performing for someone on the phone? What if he was performing for someone who was planning to kill him?" Emma's fingers stopped moving across her keyboard. "You think Marcus was being threatened? That someone forced him to set up Daddy. Think about it, Ava continued, her mind racing. Marcus gets rich, starts throwing his weight around, maybe gets involved with the wrong people. They want something from him he can't or won't give. So they threaten him, force him to frame someone else for his murder. But why Daddy? Olivia asked. Sophia's extraordinary memory was spinning like a computer hard drive. Because Marcus knew Daddy would never take a plea deal for something he didn't do. He knew Daddy would rather die than admit to being a killer in front of us. The realization hit all four of them simultaneously. James Washington hadn't just been framed for murder. He'd been specifically chosen as the fall guy because his love for his daughters made him predictably noble, predictably willing to sacrifice himself rather than compromise his integrity in their eyes. We have 18 hours, Emma said, looking at her watch. 18 hours to prove Daddy's innocence. Then we better get to work, Olivia said, already reaching for her phone to call every contact in her legal network. As the Washington sisters prepared to fight for their father's life, James lay in his cell staring at the ceiling, unaware that the four little girls he'd saved from a dumpster were about to return the favor in ways that would shake the very foundations of justice itself. The choice was no longer his to make. It belonged to four extraordinary women who had learned from their father that family never gives up, never surrenders, and never lets go, not even when the entire world is watching. The same courtroom that had been filled with despair 24 hours earlier now buzzed with an electricity that made the air itself seem alive. James Washington sat at the defendant's table, his heart hammering against his ribs as he watched his daughters file into the gallery. But they weren't alone. Behind Emma, Olivia, Sophia, and Ava came a parade of people James barely recognized. Former neighbors, old co-workers, families his daughters had helped over the years, and dozens of strangers whose lives had been touched by the ripple effects of love that had started in a Detroit alley 23 years ago. Judge Maria Santos, older now, her hair silver where it had once been black, took her seat with the gravity of someone about to render a decision that would define her legacy. She had presided over thousands of cases, but few had haunted her like this one. Your Honor, Olivia Washington stood, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never lost a case when fighting for what was right. Before you pronounce sentence, the defense has new evidence to present. District Attorney Robert Hayes, the man who had built his re-election campaign on securing James Washington's conviction, shot to his feet. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The evidence phase is closed. Your Honor, interrupted a voice from the back of the courtroom. FBI agent Sarah Rodriguez walked down the center aisle, her badge visible, her expression grim. The federal government has information relevant to this case. Judge Santos studied the packed courtroom, feeling the weight of history settling on her shoulders. Approach the bench. All of you. At the bench, Agent Rodriguez spoke in low, urgent tones. Your Honor, 3 hours ago, we arrested Vincent Morrison and his associate Tony Castellanos for the murder of Marcus Chun. Morrison is a loan shark who had been extorting Chun for months. Chun owed over $2 million in gambling debts. D.A. Hayes went pale. That's impossible. We have evidence. You have evidence that Morrison planted, Agent Rodriguez continued. Morrison knew Chun was about to expose him to federal authorities. He needed Chun dead and needed someone else to take the fall. Morrison specifically chose James Washington because... She paused, looking toward the gallery where four women sat holding each other's hands. Because Morrison knew Washington would never take a plea deal that would make him admit to being a killer in front of his daughters. Morrison counted on Washington's love for his children to ensure he die rather than confess to something he didn't do. The courtroom erupted. D.A. Hayes slumped into his chair, his political ambitions crashing around him. But Judge Santos was focused on something else. The way James Washington's shoulders had begun to shake, not with relief, but with a kind of sobs that come from a man who had been prepared to die for love and was suddenly being given life instead. Furthermore, Agent Rodriguez continued, our investigation revealed that Marcus Chun had been secretly funding college scholarships for disabled children across Michigan for the past decade. Apparently, meeting the Washington family 20 years ago changed his perspective on disability and family. Emma stood up in the gallery, tears streaming down her face. Even Marcus Chun, the man they'd thought was their father's enemy, had been transformed by witnessing their family's love. Judge Santos returned to her bench, her gavel feeling heavy in her hand. The courtroom fell silent except for the sound of James Washington crying, deep gut-wrenching sobs that seemed to release 23 years of fear, sacrifice, and unconditional love. James Washington, Judge Santos said, her voice thick with emotion. You are hereby exonerated of all charges. The court apologizes for the injustice you have suffered. But James wasn't listening to the legal language. He was listening to four voices calling out in perfect harmony, Daddy. The bailiff unlocked his shackles, and James Washington walked toward his daughters on unsteady legs. When they reached him, all four women collapsed into his arms the same way they had as children, Emma, Olivia, Sophia, and Ava, their faces pressed against his chest, their tears mixing with his. We told you, Olivia whispered against his ear. We told you families don't abandon each other. 23 years ago, Emma said, her voice breaking with joy, you saved us from dying in an alley. Today, we saved you from dying in a prison. Sophia pulled back to touch her father's face, her fingers reading the emotions written there like braille. Daddy, you taught us that love always finds a way. We just had to remind the world what real love looks like. Ava, the artist who saw beauty where others saw only darkness, smiled through her tears. We kept every letter you wrote us, every report Dr. Chin filed, every document that proved you loved us. We kept it all, Daddy, because we knew someday we'd need to show the world who you really are. As the courtroom erupted in applause, James Washington held his four daughters and remembered that February night when four tiny hands had reached through a dumpster for salvation. Today, those same hands, now strong, capable, extraordinary, had reached into a broken justice system and pulled him back from the brink of death. Dr. Margaret Chun, now 72 and officially retired, watched from the gallery with tears in her eyes. She had spent her career trying to place children in loving homes, but she had never seen love quite like this. Love that transcended biology, that turned strangers into family, that saved lives across decades. Mr. Washington, Judge Santos said as the courtroom began to quiet. I have one final order for this court. James looked up, suddenly afraid that this miracle could still be snatched away. I'm ordering the state of Michigan to provide you and your family with full compensation for this wrongful prosecution. Furthermore, I'm recommending that your case be studied as an example of the power of documented love and family bonds. She paused, looking at the extraordinary family before her. Mr. Washington, 23 years ago, you made a choice to love four children when no one else would. Today, that choice saved your life. This court hereby declares that James Washington and his daughters Emma, Olivia, Sophia, and Ava Washington are a family in every sense that matters, legal, moral, and spiritual. As the gavel fell for the final time, James whispered the same words he had spoken in that alley so many years ago. I've got you. I've got you now. But this time, it was his daughters who whispered back, and we've got you too, Daddy. Forever. 6 months later, the Washington family stood together at the dedication ceremony for the James Washington Center for Children with Disabilities in downtown Detroit. The center, funded by Marcus Chen's estate as his final act of redemption, would ensure that no child would ever again be abandoned for being different. Emma had carved into the cornerstone these words, "Love is not what you see. Love is what you choose. Love is what you keep choosing every day, no matter what." And every night in their family home on Porter Street, the same house where 4 broken angels had learned to fly, James Washington still tucked his daughters in with the same words he'd spoken on that frozen February night so long ago: "Nobody's ever going to hurt you again." Because some promises, when made with a father's love, really do last forever. What's the most powerful example of family loyalty you've ever witnessed? Share your stories in the comments about how love has triumphed in your life, because every family needs to hear that their love story matters too. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you love this story, you will surely enjoy the next one. It's crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.